Everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from America's Pacific Coast. The new news in Ukraine is that the Russians are redeploying a large force of Wagner organization peacekeepers. Now, Wagner's kind of an interesting group. They were formed originally roughly about 9 years ago for the Ukraine war, and they serve as sort of a paramilitary arm of the Kremlin that reports directly to cronies who are in Putin's inner circle. They are usually used in places where the Russians would like a degree of separation between formal Russian forces and where they know they're going to have to be particularly brutal. Wagner was used extensively in Syria as well as a number of conflicts throughout the Middle East and especially in Africa. They do very well in places where central control is thin and reporters are hard to find. As a result, they've been implicated in any number of war crimes, and so far Wagner has been involved in the Ukraine conflict already. It looks like they're going to be concentrated in moving forward in places like Mariupol, specifically so that the Russians can kill as many people as possible, especially civilians, while also saying that these folks are not part of the Russian government. I'm not quite sure why the window dressing is continuing, but I guess it helps with propaganda at home. The bigger point from the angle that I'm seeing it, however, is every time that the Russians pull forces like Wagner from other theaters to throw into Ukraine, it means that there's fewer theaters that have enough Russian troops to achieve Russian goals. So at first, the Russians were pulling troops from the Far East because they didn't believe that they needed to guard against the Chinese. So the Far East is pretty much open right now. We also know that the Russians have pulled forces from the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, which is a country that they threw troops into in a 2004 war. And those Russian troops have been largely responsible for keeping a couple of semi-independent enclaves under the Russian thumb. By pulling Wagner, it's going to be much more difficult for the Russians to control or even contribute to any sort of Russian goals throughout the overall spaces where Wagner normally works, especially sub-Saharan Africa. As the war continues to grind on, and as Russia's expeditionary capabilities focus more and more on Ukraine, Russia's ability to intervene decisively or even marginally in large parts of the world is going to zero. A few months from now, I can see it being very feasible for countries who are on the other side of the Russians everywhere to be able to move and roll up any Russian gains. So this war is still big. This war is still hot. This war is still ongoing. This war is going to last months. But every decision that the Russians make is now coming at a cost. And the strategic implications of that are going to vary region by region, decade by decade. But it does mean the large-scale melon scooping of Russian power out of large portions of the world. This general expansion of Russian reach that we have seen under Vladimir Putin is now in screaming retreat.
The man behind Wagner is Yevgeny Prigozhin, a businessman with strong ties to President Vladimir Putin's inner circle.
They are members of a ruthless gang that commits bloody crimes all over the world to support Russian interests. Ukraine, 2014. For days, the world puzzled over who the so-called Green Men were, who took Crimea in a coup d'etat. Afterwards, they fought on the side of Russian separatists in the Donbass. The men had no sovereignty insignia on their uniforms. Today, we know some of these units belonged to the Wagner Group. The mercenary force owes its name to Dmitry Utkin, a former Russian elite soldier and self-confessed neo-Nazi. He shared with Adolf Hitler a fondness for music by the composer Richard Wagner. In 2016, he was awarded a medal by President Putin. These mercenary soldiers take on the tasks that are war crimes and which regular troops refuse to perform. And now the Wagner Group is said to be active again in the Ukrainian war. There is a suspicion that President Volodymyr Zelensky, Kiev Mayor Vitaly Klitschko, and a whole series of female and other politicians are their assassination targets. Of course, that would fit into this picture that Putin wants Zelensky gone. Their tasks are exactly the same in Africa as in Ukraine: destabilization and destroying democracy. Some Malians have shown their gratitude to the Wagner Group. But wherever the Russian mercenaries have operated, they have always been extremely brutal.
It's a really big army, but not that powerful, and shown the world that they're not what we thought they would be. Throwing mercenaries into combat operations like this in Ukraine is the act of the weak. It is a desperate move to add combat power to units that are falling apart. And we're seeing that. We're seeing Russian units refusing to fight, driving their own vehicles into the mud, running over their officers. That's what happens when you lose the will to fight, you lose cohesion, you don't have no trust in your leaders. So this is an act of weakness. We usually say 3-1 if you're attacking a defender in the open, 5, if not more, depending on the situation of the urban, is because the defense is always strongest. If you can stand in a protected position, somebody has to cross the street, cross the open area to get to you, of course, you're going to be vulnerable to attack. In the urban terrain, it's just tenfold because all the buildings are natural bunkers. Matter of fact, in Mariupol, you know what makes a really good bunker? A bombed out building. So it's almost a paradox of urban warfare. We know that rubble is like bomb-proof bunkers. So you're going to need more forces, and you're going to lose thousands to take. You can't bomb cities into submission. So that's the other point. Is you not only need a lot of forces, you have to go in if you want to take it. Kyiv defending it well, they couldn't even get into position to begin to attack Kyiv. So they didn't even get past the gates. Even if you were to do this with a lot of forces, there's things you had to do. You had to surround and isolate Kyiv. They never got past really their initial positions. Many of them couldn't even get to their initial positions to isolate the city, let alone attack it. I mean, the underground has always been the refuge of urban defenders. So, I mean, more concern to me is the lack of water as they've been sieged for weeks now and the impact that has. But, you know, soldiers and, you know, motivated defenders can go a long time and suffer a lot for a cause. Could they survive the bombings? Absolutely. They could survive the bombings for a long time. But like you said, the Russians are inside. There's some elements that have penetrated, separating the defenders in different segments. But again, I still think, well, so to answer the question is they could survive weeks, is depending on what stockpiles they have inside the city. And if Mother Nature continues to help by like rain and snow and things like that to help give water, the Russians, no matter what, will pay a high price.
Clashes followed a campaign of aerial bombardment.
How can I find it?
Bombings, too, at the other airports and military sites.
Hardened mercenaries joining in the war on Ukraine. The British Defence Ministry says more than 1,000 fighters from Russian private military contractor the Wagner Group are being deployed to the country, notably around the northeastern city of Kharkiv and in the eastern Donbass region. That would be a familiar setting for the Wagner Group. The firm first rose to prominence in 2014, fighting alongside pro-Russian separatists in the Donbass as they launched a Moscow-backed war of secession from Kiev. With an estimated 2,500 to 5,000 mercenaries from both Russia and abroad, Wagner has been nicknamed Putin's private army, though the Russian president refuses to even acknowledge its existence.